Did you ever think that the more experienced sewists must be holding back on you on things they're doing that they're just not telling you? Well, in this video, let's talk about the 5 things that experienced sewists do that beginners don't. Because I can tell you, after 20 plus years of sewing, I did not do these things when I first started sewing either. My friends, welcome back. It is always so lovely to see you. If this is actually your first time here, welcome. My name is Evelyn Wood and I'm the creator of VintageSewingSchool.com. And here on this channel we do everything, well, vintage sewing skills to really help our modern day sewing. So you can create anything it is that you want in your mind. When you have the skills, you can create anything. So if you haven't yet, hit the subscribe button down below because this is what we do here all the time. And if that's what you're interested in, we have more of that coming up. So after teaching hundreds of students sewing and how to sew, I see the common things that people start to point out. So I've created this list of the 5 things that experienced sewers do that you just don't do as a beginner. Now this list will be a little bit different than probably what you're used to. It's things that really, well, you don't actually notice even until you're more experienced. So take, for example, when I was a beginner, if someone told me this list when I was a very beginner, I'd kind of think, okay, but I don't really see the difference. I don't get it much. And it's because it just comes with experience that you start to see these things and notice these things, and that's why you implement them into your sewing routine. So hence why this list will be a little bit different than the kind of top pointers that you're used to hearing about. Okay, so the first one is expecting the machine to do all the work for you. When we're beginning, I definitely remember doing this, is you just, let me demonstrate. You put this in, right, and you say like this, and then you say, go, go, go. And you just sew, and you kind of just kind of gently help it along, and you just say go, go, go. That's what it feels like anyway. My members of Vintage Sewing School hear this so often, and that is me saying, you are in control. You tell the fabric what to do. Learning to maneuver and learn the skill of maneuvering and telling the fabric what to do at the machine is the single best skill that you can possibly learn to improve your sewing skills. For example, one of my students was wondering whether or not to get a walking foot, and then she remembered listening to one of my videos where I mentioned, I have one, I've never used it. And that's because I've learnt to maneuver the fabric and get skilled at doing this, and therefore a walking foot has never really been necessary in my sewing. And so she decided that she was also going to learn to really get to grips and learn how to sew. And a few of my points lead on to telling the fabric what to do more specifically, but it's getting here and maneuvering and really skillfully telling the fabric what to do. I get pointed out from my students all the time when they watch me really closely just how much I'm going slow and just telling the fabric what to do, not sitting here and just gently like go, go on the machine. So I promise learning that skill is the most important skill you can possibly learn in sewing to heighten your end garment results, how well your garments turn out. The next one is sewing in a curve. Yes, okay, so let me demonstrate again because I know I did this when I first started sewing. What you do, for example, if we have a curve like this, generally our brain tells us to pull it straight and we sew like this and we make everything straight lines and we try and sew it straight through the machine because it's really hard, right? I absolutely get it. I remember doing this so much. But when I really started to look at what I was doing and upskill my sewing machine maneuverability is sewing in a curve. And you'll see all experienced sewists really do this and use this to their advantage, where instead of pulling it straight and sewing like this, you work with the curves, right? So we'd put this here and actually sew, and the whole garment will move with us, and we sew in that curve, because then how could it possibly go wrong? There couldn't be any puckery stitches. The stitch can't look weird. when it is sitting flat and we're literally sitting over the top of that exact shape that the garment is supposed to form. Of course it's going to turn out well if it's sewn in the shape that it's going to end up, rather than forcing it into a shape it's not meant to be, stitching it, and then trying to hope that it curls back to the shape that it should be. So think about this as sewing with the curves, with the shapes of your garments, rather than just trying to pull it straight and sew straight under the machine. And then there is the fact that experienced sewists always focus on the stitch line. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this term, that is your actual line that you will stitch on. So if you have 1.5 centimeter seam allowance or 5/8, your stitch line is that 5/8 of an inch line all the way inside your garment where you would actually stitch. Definitely, as you get more experienced, you really start to focus on this and nothing else. I call seam allowance as dead space, particularly when we talk about pattern making. You'll see, and all my members know this, that all of my patterns, and I encourage everyone to actually mark out the stitch line all over your pattern so you can actually see what your pattern is and you can understand the stitch line is the most important thing. Everything is measured off that stitch line, even when you're pattern making and including when you're sewing. It comes down to pinning. I always like to pin like vertically in line with my edge, with my seam allowance. So I'm pinning on my seam line like this, and I'm using my pins as a stitch basically on my stitch line, rather than you see some pinning crosswise like this. Does not work for me at all. Comes into different methods, but the focus is on the stitch line and nothing else. So when you get more experienced, you really start realizing that everything around sewing, around patterns in particular, and then obviously that's how it's all sewn together, is that it's all based around the stitch line. And when you start working from that outwards, it makes everything a lot easier. It's kind of what you actually have to do to make things work. Sewing over pins. I hear this one so often from in the comments here all the time of more experienced sewists always comment on the fact that don't sew over pins. It seems like a really good idea when you're starting because it keeps everything in place, right? And you can just sew and it keeps it all there. Oh no, don't do it. Too many of us have broken needles, actually damaged your machine, and it's just not a good habit to get into sewing over your pins. Now there are exceptions, and you will see me doing this. As a general rule, don't sew over them. Pull them out just before you get there. And another reason is because keeping your pins in will actually force your fabric in positions it's maybe not meant to do. As you sew, your foot actually puts pressure on this top layer and forces more fabric of this top layer to bunch up. And so if you're not really careful, that's when you end up with little tucks, little pulls. And that's where our number one, maneuvering the fabric, is pulling out your pin and adjusting just before you're sewing that little bit, pulling out your pin, adjusting that next section, sewing, and that's how you get really smooth, even, no puckers, no funny bits happening everywhere. And because if your pin is locked it in place, you'll end up with little tucks underneath because it has nowhere to go. Your pin has locked it in position, but your top layer might move. And of course, as I said, there was an exception. So sometimes meeting seams, where you say have a waist seam and you have your bodice and then your skirt seam matching up and you're sewing this seam here, I would put a cross pin over here, what I call a cross pin. I would pin vertically all across the waist seam and then one this way to really hold that in place. And I would actually very gently, and usually I would even hand wheel over it so I don't do any damage. Even if my needle does accidentally hit it, it's going that slow that it just pushes it to the side vertically, and I can sew over that one stitch and have my seam lines matching up perfectly. I would say that is the only exception, is when you're just going to gently hand wheel it over. But sewing over pins is, I hear all the time from the experienced sewist. Have you broken a needle from sewing over your pins? Leave us a comment down below. It's always interesting to hear everyone's scary stories, a cautionary tale for the people that haven't yet maybe caused any damage by sewing over pins. We can warn them all give them the cautionary tale so that we all stop doing this and we don't want to damage our machines by doing so. A pattern is merely a tool of sewing. It is not sewing in its entirety. I think all experienced sewists are going to say the same thing here, in that a sewing pattern is just a tool. It's an aid of sewing. It's something, a helpful, useful tool. It is not sewing in its entirety whatsoever. We just use this as an aid, a starting point, something to help start our design, but you know that it needs to be tweaked. The size needs to be adjusted. You'll end up making your own copy and then fitting it to you. And then you can even decide which different ways to sew different construction methods together. As you get more experienced, you realize that it is simply an aid of sewing. It's a tool. It is not sewing. As we are led to believe when we first begin sewing, that we can pick up this pattern and we can learn to sew from a pattern. And this is sewing, right? You pick a pattern and you sew it up, and that is sewing in its entirety. No, it doesn't take long before you realize they need to be adjusted. And then as you get further and further more advanced, you really understand that you're using it as a tool only. Sewing patterns were never designed as a learn to sew device. They were designed for home dressmakers who already know how to sew, which at the time was fairly common knowledge. Most people made their own clothing still. So these skills were just common knowledge skills. They were an aid, a tool. You could mail order them so that you could start designing different designs, but you already knew how to sew them together. I think it's very relevant when you see even antique and then even more vintage patterns. As you go further back through the history of sewing patterns, you see that when they first started, the instructions given at the time are basically zero. It is just the pattern, because when you know how to sew, you decide how you want to sew it together. It's just a tool to use. But as sewing skills have decreased through our common knowledge, as we come up to modern times in history, they've had to include more and more sewing instructions to include with the patterns, because there is less a common knowledge of sewing, and that is what we call the assumed knowledge of sewing. And what I hope to answer here, and it's my hope that I unveil all of those mysteries and help others just like you on your sewing journey, so it's not so hard to uncover all these assumed knowledge of sewing patterns. It's just that they're never designed as a learn to sew device. They are a tool only, and I hope that you learn much quicker than I did that you can use this just as a tool and learn all the skills needed to use it in that way, because that's how you really create what you want. And of course, if you're interested in taking your sewing skills further down that track and learning all this in a really in an environment that you have access to a library of all of this information 24/7. That's what I do at vintagesewingschool.com. And I mean, there's links down below, so I would love to have you join me there. But so tell me, my friends, what do you think of my list? Essentially, I would love to hear your comments and tell me the ones that I've missed out. What do you think what have you either noticed or know yourself that experienced sewists do that beginners don't? Maybe in your own journey, help all of us beginner sewers, and maybe the points that we've never heard of before, because by sharing all of our information together is how we all learn and become better sewists. Thank you so much for watching. Check the description box below for all of the links. And until next time, my sewing friends, happy sewing. Bye.